Space Ghost started life as a straight-faced 1960s superhero flying through space with a monkey and two teen sidekicks, and somehow ended up as a talk show host mumbling his way through deeply awkward celebrity interviews at midnight. The transformation from earnest Hanna Barbera hero to the deadpan center of Space Ghost Coast to Coast is one of the strangest glowdowns in cartoon history, and it only happened because one network was told to use, quote, the forgettable ones. In the original Space Ghost and Dino Boy series, Space Ghost was drawn by legendary designer Alex Toth as a no-nonsense space vigilante, blasting villains like Zorak and Moltar with his power band beams, while his teen partners Jan and Jace and their monkey Blip tagged along. He could turn invisible, survive in space, and fly, and all of it was played absolutely straight. The character came back briefly in the early 80s anthology Space Stars. He was still a traditional hero at this point, but then he more or less disappeared into the Hanna Barbera library. When Turner and Cartoon Network later dug through that library looking for characters to repurpose, executives told producer Mike Lazo to just grab the forgettable ones, the old IP that nobody cared about anymore. That is how Space Ghost got pulled out of the vault. He was expendable enough to mess with. Now the irony, of course, is that choosing a forgettable hero is what made the reinvention possible. You can only turn a stoic cosmic police officer into a struggling talk show host if nobody at the top is guarding the brand's dignity. Space Ghost Coast to Coast started as a Cartoon Network promo experiment. Programmers were re-editing old cartoons to act as channel hosts just for a day, and Space Ghost's bit was to introduce other shows as if he were a late-night talk show host, complete with a rhyming title, Coast to Coast. The proof of concept pilot was assembled in 1993 by Andy Merrill in a literal closet at Turner Broadcasting, using a reel-to-reel tape machine and recycled footage. Merrill even voiced Space Ghost himself in that internal test, cutting together an interview that was built from old CNN footage of Denzel Washington. That pilot never aired, but an edited version eventually surfaced on DVD with Washington's image removed. That means that somewhere out there, there's a pilot where Space Ghost appears to be grilling nobody, which, to be fair, is a lot of how those interviews felt anyway. Cartoon Network liked the experiment enough to order a real show, and Space Ghost Coast to Coast premiered on April 15, 1994, as one of the channel's earliest original series that wasn't just an anthology of existing cartoons. It aired initially at 11 p.m. on Friday nights, with encores on Saturdays, unknowingly staking out a late-night slot that would eventually mutate into the entire Adult Swim identity. The wild part is that the show's most radical trick, which is its interviews, was never fully scripted when the guests sat down. All of that nonsensical chaos was later baked into the production process from day one. Before any sods were formally written, the production team would book a guest and then bring them into a makeshift studio, sometimes with a crew member wearing a Space Ghost costume made famous in the Cartoon Planet intros. The interviewer instructed each guest to address him as Space Ghost to maintain the illusion that they were really talking to an animated host instead of a random employee in a room wearing a costume.
I'm hosting it. Space Ghost!
Most early guests thought that they were doing a fairly straightforward, if slightly odd, interview. Only later, as the show's reputation grew, did guests start arriving with some idea that their answers would be chopped up and then used in ways that would make them look confused or irritated or vaguely terrified of the cartoon host.
I'm a Space Ghost, you silly.
After the interview, writers and editors combed through the raw footage and they would yoink lines out of context, rearrange them, and then stitch them into a new conversation, using that word loosely, that Space Ghost would respond to. The actual episodes were built around those Frankenstein interviews, with Space Ghost and Zorak and Moltar's dialogue written to turn innocent answers into awkward and antagonistic bits.
I enjoy talking to you.
Even the sidekick role had a darker, tragic footnote. Early on in development, the team planned to use actor Hervé Villechaize as a live-action sidekick, but those plans ended when he passed away, forcing the team to rethink the dynamic and then lean more into the villain-turned-bandleader roles for Zorak and Moltar. Because Space Ghost Coast to Coast reused limited animation from the original 60s series, its production process looked almost upside down when compared to a normal cartoon. Most cartoons at the time would have the majority of their production time in drawing, but in the case of Space Ghost, however, it would be the editing that was the most time-intensive part. Every shrug, and eye blink, and mouth flap had to be pulled from old footage and then timed to the newly written dialogue. The end result was this odd visual style that sort of looked like paper dolls glued to popsicle sticks that were jerkily sliding around a flat desk and a background that rarely, if ever, changed. Crudely animated lips, awkward pauses, and continuity errors started to become part of the joke, which underscored how fake and stiff the talk show host really was. Production of the first season was handled by Design Effects in Atlanta, chosen largely because the studio was close to Cartoon Network headquarters. In show business, this is known as the "they're down the street and they answered the phone" method of talent selection. As the show continued to develop, the loose group of producers and writers around it, Mike Lazo, Matt Mailero, Dave Willis, Andy Merrill, and others, coalesced into what became Ghost Planet Industries and eventually William Street, which is the in-house outfit that would define Adult Swim. Space Ghost was no longer the weird little experiment. It was now the seed around which Cartoon Network's entire late-night identity would grow. The question was, how long could that formula of cheap animation, brutal editing, and deadpan absurdity keep evolving and reiterating? Space Ghost Coast to Coast's run is chopped into phases that sort of mirror Cartoon Network's own late-night evolution. The original run aired from April 15th of 1994 to December 17th of 1999, drifting through various weekend late-night slots and often followed by reruns of the original 1960s Space Ghost episodes, sometimes even with added laugh tracks. After a brief hiatus, the show was revived on May 7th of 2001, just as Cartoon Network launched Adult Swim as a new dedicated late-night block. New episodes moved there on September 2nd of 2001, airing until April 12th of 2004, and setting the tone for the entire block's off-kilter, low-budget, high-weirdness aesthetic. The final season is even stranger, though. Instead of airing on TV, the last batch of episodes was released exclusively through the GameTap online service between 06 and 08, extending the show's life into the early streaming era in a way that almost nobody saw. In total, 109 episodes were produced over 10 seasons, although episode numbering is a bit of a mess, with some finales being mislabeled on Adult Swim's own site and certain intended episodes never being finished. At one point, there were plans for more episodes that would have included interviews with Seth MacFarlane and Seth Green, among others, but those ideas were remained shelved when the decision was made to wrap the series around its 10th anniversary instead. All of those things combined leave the show with this sort of half-open ending, a cult classic that just sort of slips off into late-night reruns and obscure online releases rather than getting any sort of big farewell. Even after Space Ghost Coast to Coast stopped producing new episodes, Space Ghost still popped up in other Adult Swim shows and specials, and he even resurfaced in 2010, interviewing Tommy Wiseau in bumpers for Adult Swim's April Fool's airing of The Room. This was indeed a pairing of two cult oddities that made almost too much sense. The show also ran into a modern problem that older cartoons never had to worry about: home video rights. Some of the celebrity interviews used in episodes were never licensed for DVD or streaming releases, which meant certain episodes or segments couldn't be included on official box sets, leaving gaps in the series for fans trying to collect the entire thing. Meanwhile, the original superhero version of Space Ghost found a second life all on its own. In the 2000s, DC Comics published a miniseries that reimagined Space Ghost as a serious hero once again, exploring an origin story in which a man named Thaddeus dons the power bands and cape to hunt down the Wraith, blending pulp revenge with the older cartoon mythology. So with this, you end up with a bit of a character that's split into three different parts. One of those is the earnest 60s hero, another one is the deadpan 90s talk show host, and then the third one is this dark and brooding 2000s comic anti-hero. None of them really cancel the other ones out though. They all sit side by side as a bit of a reminder that sometimes the quote trash IP that a network tosses to the weird kids in the closet is exactly the thing that comes back years later as the heart and the punchline of an entire late-night culture. Now, when I think about my own memories of watching Space Ghost Coast to Coast, all I can think of is just hanging out with my dad late at night, watching the show on Adult Swim, and then him sitting next to me, just giggling, trying not to wake up my mom, who's asleep upstairs, and then me sitting next to him, not understanding a single bit of what was so funny. He was over there just holding his mouth with his hand, trying not to loud laugh, and wake everybody up. And then me, I didn't get it, but I was like a preteen, maybe even a little bit younger. But anyway, that's my recollection of Space Ghost. I loved going back in the research of this video and watching some of the older episodes and just really reliving the awkwardness of the editing. Hey, I hope you consider joining the Patreon for special perks. One of those perks includes seeing your name rolling through the credits at the end of every future episode. And you know what? Since you remembered Space Ghost Coast to Coast, you probably remember the thing that's on screen now just as much. Click on it. Let's talk about it.